Okay, hi, everyone. I'm going to dive right in because, I think I got cut off. Hi, everyone. I'm going to dive right in because we're in chapter 7 of First Corinthians this week, and it's a big chapter. It has to do with marriage, singleness, things like that. And there's a lot of really big things. There's a lot of verses in this chapter that are taken out of context a lot and therefore misused. So I'll try to walk through as much of that as I can. I don't know if I can anticipate everything, but we'll try. So, of course, follow up on last week, honoring God with your body. Um, See if anybody felt like they did that this past week. Okay, so let's take this one bit at a time. The first section I have you looking at is the first 6 verses of the chapter, and I made kind of an intentional break there so that people would understand that verse about concession. Verse 6 has to do with what I've been reading and what I kind of understand. It seems like that verse has to do more with verse 5 than with what he's about to say. So the concession is to say when you are abstaining from sex in marriage for a certain amount of time, that is the concession. He's saying that's not the norm. That's the concession. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So that's why I've split it there at verse 6 to try to make that clear grammatically. In the Greek, there's no like paragraphs and stuff like that. So um, anyway, I hope that makes sense. So to understand what Paul's saying in these verses, we have to understand why he said these things. And it's clear that the issue that Paul is responding to is this kind of anti-material issue. And what I mean by anti-material is like all things of this world, all pleasure, all desire is bad. And that the goal of our spirituality is to rid ourselves of those desires and those pleasures and things like that. Now, I want to be really careful here because there is this sense where God calls us to set our mind on things above, not on things of this earth. That is a part of our spirituality, but and it's an important part. So when I ask you, how is Paul combating that? What he's really getting at here is he's saying that it's somehow unholy um, to have any kind of pleasure or desire, that our life is meant to be just simply rigorous and without any of these good things in life. And that's not Christianity. Christianity says God made everything and all things are good. The problem is that our relationship with God is broken, and therefore we start to use other things as they weren't meant to be used. Our relationship with those other things is broken as well. Um, so Paul's combating that by saying, no, like sex within marriage is a good thing. That was the issue that was coming up here. Um, or sex in general is not an inherent bad thing. So the next question is, if they're not inherently evil, does this give us a license for giving into any desire? No, it's not, of course. But why? Like, how do we decide? How do we deal with desires in a godly way? So think about that. I think it's an important thing to think about as we have these desires come up. How do we process them? How do we know whether or not they're of God? How do we deal with them? And what I think is important to note here is that Paul is not going to just say like, "Oh, hey, if you want to have sex, like make a way so that you can have sex." You need to balance this with the rest of the chapter, where Paul is kind of saying, "Hey, if you can stay single, you should do that too." Um, so we need to be careful not to say like, "Well, I have this desire, so I'm just going to figure out how that desire can be used well, and then figure out a way to do it." That's not necessarily the point. Paul is speaking to a specific issue. Okay. Wow, that's the first 6 verses. There's a lot to say about this chapter. Next, we're going to look at 7 to 16 broadly. But first of all, 7 to 9 has to do specifically with singleness. Now, he's saying that he wishes that all people were single like him. And this messes a lot of people up too. Again, we have to balance this with the rest of the chapter and with what Paul says in Ephesians about marriage, which is really high regard for marriage. So you have to remember that he's speaking to a certain group of people who need to hear a certain thing based on what they're struggling with. Um, Now and also at the second half of verse 7, he's saying, "I wish that you were of me," but remember, everyone has their own gift. Um, this would have been shocking to people who are Jews, and I say that here. They valued marriage as like if you get married, um, that is how you succeed socially. Basically, it's the foundation of that. That's not too different from how we think about it. Um, so I have some questions. So work through singleness there and how we've seen it devalued, what it would look like to value and support single people. And you guys have special insight into this, being people who are not married. Um, but then what I think is remarkable is that in verse 7, he calls singleness and marriage a gift. And that word gift is charisma, which is the same word he uses for spiritual gifts later in the chapter or later in the book, I think chapter 12. And and so he's saying when you have a spiritual gift, that gift is not for you, it's for building up the church. So think, how can either your singleness or your marriage serve the church? I'll give you an example of both. Like, so as a married couple, me and Chelsea want to serve single people, and we should be careful to do that, um, because I think single people can be devalued. And so one thing we did is, a lot of you know, we wanted to open up our room for a roommate, and we wanted to do it at like a really is as cheap as we felt like we could do rate. And so we opened up our room to someone who was single, and we've tried to integrate Adam as our roommate into our family as much as we can. It's hard because both of our lives are crazy, but we want to invite him into our family as much as possible and make meals for him when we can. Do everything we can to make his life easy and to help him feel like a part of our family and engage with our kids and stuff like that. And so we serve him. Single people can serve married people by babysitting, by being present in their homes, by investing in the person of the same sex, like in either the husband or the wife, um, being a voice, being a listening ear for that person. So we should be serving each other in our singleness and in our marriage. They really are a gift to the church. Okay, that's singleness. And I've alluded to marriage here, and the next part is about marriage, and also about divorce. There's a ton here. Man, this could go off on so many rabbit trails. Um, so, what I want you to do, I'm not even going to talk about this, but read note number 2. That'll help you with some issues. What Paul's saying, not me, but the Lord. I'll explain that here because I'm already going to be making a long video. Um, but the baseline command about divorce is in 10 and 11. Basically, the goal is to not separate, and if they do, to remain unmarried. That is the baseline. And what I want you to understand, what I've come to understand as I've been studying this, I've been reading and reading and reading, trying to give you guys a succinct thing. I was trying to boil down, how can I boil down divorce into this thing that they can take away and understand? And what I've realized is it is really complex. The ins and outs of what permits divorce. And I have you looking at some of these passages here. And what I think we can say a lot, and we should talk about this, because divorce is not good. I think we can even see that just from a normal life stance. I mean, divorce is a result of brokenness. It results in more brokenness oftentimes. But even as I'm saying this, I know that there's a lot of issues out there, like abuse and uh, just infidelity and things like that. And so, what I think we need to do is we need to be really sensitive about this issue because we have something to say about it, and the scriptures are clear, and we can let the scriptures speak for themselves. But we need to be pastoral, we need to be caring, we need to be loving, we need to show grace as God has shown us grace. One thing I can say about marriage is in bold: the overwhelming priority in marriage is reconciliation. That is God's utmost intent for marriage relationships. So there's a lot of nuance to this, and we need to recognize that. But we can say that this is the standard. This is the desire. We should always be shooting for that. We should always be aiming to support people's marriages, encouraging them to pursue reconciliation, because that's a picture of the gospel. That's a picture of how God has pursued us. That's what marriage is meant to be. I just answered the next question. The next highlighted question: Have you seen divorce and remarriage result in hurt and pain? Remarriage is a whole nother can of worms. Um, but anyway, I think these questions are pretty easy to understand. A couple of things to note. I have a note on verse 14. Note number 3 addresses that, so please see that. And also verses 15 and 16 are actually kind of amazing, saying that if an unbeliever leaves, so if a believer and an unbeliever are married, and so Christ would have lived during this time, so they would have been married as people who didn't believe, and then Christ came and one of them believed. This is not grounds to say marry an unbeliever. I don't think that's a great idea. We should be yoked equally, so the scriptures say. The brother or sister is not bound. God has called us to live at peace. Man, I just didn't even have time to unpack these verses. But we see here that even when God's priority is reconciliation, that He can redeem divorce and remarriage, and um, He can just do more than we think He can. Uh, Even when people are broken and do broken things, God will redeem even the worst of those things if we let Him. Well, sometimes He does anyway. But yeah, just anyway, chew on that for a while, if you will. So finally, I have you looking at 17 to 24, and these verses serve as a hinge in the chapter. So they have something to do with what's said in 1 to 16, and something to do with what's said in 25 to 40. I will address these verses as they relate to 25 to 40 next week, but I think that the message here that we can hear as they relate to the first half of the chapter, and it won't be too different for the second half, but um, sometimes we tend to take sudden action to change our life in some way, to think that if we somehow change our circumstance, that's going to be how we can be pleasing to God with our life. So, I've come to this new level of knowing God. I really need to change my major because that would please God more. This biology is not spiritual enough. Or if I could just date somebody, or if I could move, or if I could have this job, or something about our lives could change because that would really just put us in a better place to serve God. We can really spiritualize that. And I'm not saying that's never true, but we should take Paul's warning here carefully. Be slow, be patient. Um, we should remember that God is asking us to serve as we are and where we are. We need to learn to serve Him even in tough situations. And we shouldn't just jump, especially into a relationship or out of a relationship, because we think that's going to be pleasing to God. Now, sometimes it's pretty clear that we need to jump out of a relationship. And if that's clear, we should do that. But in general, we need to be thoughtful and purposeful about these things. Um, so I'm asking you to think through that a little bit. How can we process these thoughts that we have about just wanting to change and really wanting to please God, which is a great desire. But sometimes we go about that in the wrong way rather than feel like we need to change everything about our life and about our circumstance. Sometimes we need to change a lot about our lives because our lives are full of sin and brokenness, and we should change those things if we can. But how can we serve God when we're feeling oppressed, or when we're feeling trapped, or when we're feeling hopeless? How can we serve God in those things? Because it's a misnomer to say, like, well, once I get into a relationship, then I'll be content and then I can serve God, because that's a trap. We don't want to fall into that. And so I hope you'll think about how that shapes the way we think about romantic relationships. Oh man. Okay, finally at the conclusion. um, so I give a little blurb there about I hope it makes sense. They don't Relationships, of course, don't define our identity nor our ability to serve God. We're called to serve God out of whatever place we're in. So we shouldn't change in order to serve God. That's a misnomer. Change circumstance. I hope I'm clear. Sometimes we do need to change as we discover sin and rebellion to God. That's not what I mean. I just mean like our life circumstance. So I gave some challenges here. Some for dating folks, some for single folks. And I realize that this passage is not about dating, but as we talked about, a couple 6 or 3, dating is kind of a precursor to marriage, and so I think it does apply. And for both groups, asking you to do something that's outward focused. For single folks, just find something to do that's outward focused, that doesn't serve you in any way, that's just about someone else. And I'd encourage dating folks to try to do that together, especially as you consider marriage. To serve together, do something outward together can be good for you in discerning whether or not that relationship is good for you, and also good for your personal relationship with God. This is an important part of being with someone long term. How can you serve together with that person? Um, and just I ask you to schedule a time to spend away from each other. Oh, I'm sorry. That's for the dating people to spend some time away from each other. I know that might sound strange, but really, a healthy dating relationship is born out of two people who have healthy relationships with the Lord. And spending time with the Lord is not about your dating relationship. That's not what I'm trying to say here. But I think that when you spend time away from each other, that can be good for you and good for your relationship. And it's good to come together and talk about it. So I think it's good on all fronts, is what I'm trying to say. Um, if you're single, please I encourage you to spend some time with God, um, and ask Him how He wants you to currently love people as you are. Um, okay. I think that's all for now. This has been a lot. Please ask me any questions you have. I'm glad to do this out on Monday, not Wednesday. So please come to me with any questions that you have about these verses. And next week is FTLT, so we're not doing First Corinthians. So you'll be back on this chapter in 2 weeks. Okay. Love you all. Talk to you soon.